Hey guys, thanks again for being a part of a life group and continuing our study through the book of Galatians. We're in session 4 this time, and I'm really looking forward to what God has to say in chapter 4. It's an amazing chapter in the book of Galatians. Just to kind of catch you up if you hadn't been with us or maybe you forgot week to week, the book of Galatians is written by this guy named Paul, and Paul was a guy who was very religious. He literally lived his life to kill Christians. You actually look in the book of Acts early on, before Paul became a follower of Christ, and he was actually trying to kill Christians. Actually, when this guy named Stephen was stoned with rocks and killed, Paul was there overseeing that. So, he was a murderer. He was a terrible guy. And something amazing happened. God invaded his life and transformed his heart. Isn't that true of my life and your life? It's so amazing how he does that. Well, this guy Paul, who was so religious and so strict about keeping the Old Testament law, has this radical transformation where he goes from being spiritually blind and spiritually dead to being made alive and seeing things with such incredible clarity. And Paul then becomes one of the greatest church planters in the world. He was the greatest church planter in that time and in that part of the world. God sent him out and he planted churches literally all over the known world. It's an amazing thing to look at his missionary journeys. Well, as Paul was planting these churches, he would go and he would plant churches in different places, and then he would move on and he would plant churches in other places. Well, he would then write these letters, what we refer to as books in the New Testament, to these churches addressing different things that were going on. Well, the book of Galatians is written specifically to address this false teaching that was taking place. There was this group of very religious people, like Paul used to be, and they were telling the new believers, the new Christ followers, that they needed more than just Jesus, that they had to keep this Old Testament law to be made right with God. Well, as you can guess, that threw them into mass confusion. A lot of crazy stuff was going on, and Paul writes this letter to address those kind of issues, because they were telling them that Christ was not enough. And Paul says, no, He is enough. And in chapter 4, we're going to look at an amazing thing where Paul talks about just how intimate and intense our relationship is with God the Father through what Christ has done for us. He talks about it being a father. You know what's really interesting, and I don't know your story, but my story was, my dad is an alcoholic, and he's always been an alcoholic. And my parents got divorced when I was 1, and it was just a crazy life growing up. And so when I read these verses and I saw, man, I have a Father in heaven who loves me, who pursues me, who wants me to know Him, and He wants to know me, and He wants to be in relationship with me. It was an incredible thing to think that there's nothing I can do to earn that relationship. But God came to me. God came through His Son to be made so that I could be made right with Him. And that is true for you. You know, in a world where we're just bombarded by a lot of religious stuff, religiosity, I will say, and where we even begin to put these own religious rules on our necks again, and they begin to weigh us down and make us feel like we're not worthy, that God doesn't love us. Well, the same thing's happening here. And I want you to hear these verses in chapter 4. You guys are going to look at verse 1 through 7, but I'm only going to read verse 4 through 7. He says, "But when the time had fully come, when it was the perfect time, God sent His Son, born of a woman." Jesus came and He was born the same way you and I are. He was born of a woman. God, the creator of the universe, He sent His Son to come through the very thing He created, which is woman. He was born of a woman just like me and you. And then He was born under the law. See, Jesus came when the Jews were still required to keep the law to be made right with God. And Jesus was born under that law so that He could fully keep that law for me and you. So it says He was born under the law, check this out, to redeem. I already explained last week what the word redeem means, but it means to be made alive, to be made right, to be brought out of a place of death and into a place of life. So Jesus came, He was born of a woman, born under the law, to rescue us, to make us right, to redeem those under the law. You see, everybody will be judged under God's law. But when you come into relationship with Jesus, He has fully accomplished that law on your behalf. And so you are no longer under the penalty of that law. He said He came for those under law that they might receive the full rights of sons. So Jesus came to die on the cross, to live a perfect life, to defeat death through the grave, so that you and I could be made children of God, so that we could receive the full rights of sons. If you understand this culture during that time, that was a powerful thing, that God cares so much for me and you that we would earn the right to be called His son, to be called His daughter. And then He goes on in verse 6, He says, because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts. And it just gets even better. Not only do we receive the full right, but God sends His Spirit to live inside of us. The same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead, the same power that was with Jesus, comes and lives in us and makes us alive, to live in our hearts. The Spirit who called out, Abba, Father. Man, that connection, that relationship that we go from being far from God, cast out because of the sin in our life. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. Nobody brings anything to God of any worth because we are broken, messed up people and God is completely perfect and holy. But yet, at the perfect time, God sent His Son to be born of a woman under the law to bring us to earn the full rights to be sons and daughters of His, so that we could call Him Abba, Father. The intimacy there, the intentionality that God brings us into a personal relationship. You know, all the other religions in the world don't communicate with God about that. If you look at Muslims, they don't think about God as a father. They think about God as this distant being who is difficult and rough and mean. They don't think about God as love. But yet we see the truth of who God is. He is our Father. He loves us. Check this out. I love this. He says, so you are no longer a slave. You were once a slave because there was no hope for you, there was no hope for me. But you're no longer a slave, but a son. And since you were a son, God has made you an heir. You have an inheritance. That inheritance is to be forever in relationship with God, to inherit eternal life, which I don't even know, well, I'm confident that we can't even dare wrap our minds around or grasp how incredible what we're going to inherit is. And God has left us here on this earth for a purpose, and that purpose is to share that with other people. Man, I hope you guys have an incredible group tonight. I hope you celebrate that God is your Father. He loves you. He is there for you. He came to bring you into relationship with Him, and you have a great future ahead. Thanks.